to Silvicast, the podcast about all things silviculture. My name is Brad Hutnick.
And I'm Greg Edge.
We're both silviculturists with the Wisconsin DNR Division of Forestry and your host for today's show. Gregor.
Bradley.
My dad called me Bradley. That sounds a little formal, doesn't it?
Well, Bradley, I could call you something else.
No. I can only imagine, Greg, what you're going to try to call me. And we've gotten an explicit rating in the past. I don't think we want another one of those.
I don't know why, but...
Okay. So back up the beer truck. So doing what we do as silviculturists, what do you do when you don't have a good answer for a question?
Well, let's see. Michelle tells me that I do make up a lot of answers, but I really just tell her that's part of being a forester. You kind of have to be a generalist and know a little bit about a lot of different topics. So I just call it professional judgment. However, she says it's really just code for being a know-it-all.
Yeah, I think we call that the always certain, often wrong school of forestry.
Yeah, that's probably accurate.
Yeah, and I have to admit, I once had a fellow forester tell me in all seriousness that bloodroot was really called buttleaf aster.
What? It's not?
It's not. Who knew?
Well, if I answer that question seriously, there are other options when you don't know the answer. You could always say, it depends. You know, that's a really famous silviculture reason for getting out of anything, really.
True. But there's another option, right?
Yes, of course there is. I think the best option is you stick with what you know. And if you don't know something, you say, I don't know.
Exactly. Now, I recently had some questions about how we integrate carbon considerations into silviculture. And I have to admit my best answer was good question.
Brad, I suspect that you and I and most of our listeners might be in the same boat. So to help us get up to speed on forest carbon, our guest today is Dr. Alexandra Kosiba with the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. Allie works with the Securing Northeast Forest Carbon Program, a cooperative effort by the state foresters of New England. The program's goal is to secure carbon on private forest lands. And as part of this, Allie has done some excellent work teaching foresters about the fundamentals of forest carbon.
Nice. This is going to be a whole lot better than making stuff up.
And it's going to actually be part one of a two-part series on carbon. So we're going to talk with Allie today about the fundamentals of forest carbon. But then on the next episode, we're going to get into some real details about silviculture and carbon.
And if you're listening to this episode, you're eligible for continuing education credits. So if you're looking for SAF continuing education credits, if you're a cooperating consulting forestry in Wisconsin, you can get credit for it. Or if you're looking for CE credits anywhere in the United States, let us know. Check out the Silvicast website to learn more about this. Allie Kosiba, welcome to Silvicast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Now, Allie, for our listeners who may not be familiar with you, tell us a little bit about you and your career.
Sure. Well, I'm currently the climate forester for Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation, and I proudly say I'm the first climate forester in the state. There have since been a few of them in other states, but really I focus on climate change, impacts to forests, ways we can manage our forests for resilience and adaptation. And a lot of my work focuses on forest carbon. How can we manage for it better? How can we incorporate it into state policy to meet our, net zero emission goals, and all sorts of things like that. So mostly science education. And my background, I'm a forest ecologist and tree physiologist. And my background is in how trees and forests are impacted by climate change and other stressors. And what are the things we can do as managers and foresters to sort of reduce some of those vulnerabilities and increase resilience.
Wow. And I know from listening to some webinars recently that you're also involved with the Northeast Forest Carbon Program. So what is that program?
Yeah, so that's a program that's been funded by the USDA Forest Service, state and private forestry Northeast Midwest program for the landscape scale restoration grant. And Charlie Levesque is applied for a 3-year grant to provide education and resources to landowners and foresters about forest carbon and forest carbon offset markets and payment programs to sort of understand how those work and better set up landowners for success. And we kicked off the program last fall, winter. And one of the parts of this is we have a state in each one of the 7 states. So it's all the New England states and New York. Each one of the 7 states have a state agency point person that is the point person for landowners and consulting foresters on forest carbon and forest carbon information. And we also have a really great website you can check out called northeastforestcarbon.org, clearinghouse of tools, resources, information for landowners and foresters.
Wow. It sounds like a cool program that we could emulate in other parts of the country. That's really cool.
Yes, that's the hope.
Hey, Allie, I'm going to ask you just a more general question. One of the things we oftentimes like to ask our guest is, how did you get involved in forestry? Because it always has interesting answers.
Yeah, so I've always been really involved and interested in the outdoors and science, really, like how things work and how like the inner workings of trees and plants and how those trees and plants work together. But really the catalyst for me, I actually was able to study abroad in college and went to Australia, which has the northeast part of Australia is the only part of the country with tropical rainforest. And that really was I just loved the work that they were doing there, the researchers, and they were already looking at, so I'm not going to date myself too much, but they were already looking at impacts of climate change on these forests because being so close to the equator, the change, a smaller change in temperature is really dramatic for these forests. So it was really cool, really set me on a path of looking at forests. And I did a lot of work after my undergraduate degree. I traveled around country working various kind of temporary jobs for the Forest Service, nonprofit groups, groups around the country doing work for restoration and forest-related efforts.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You were going to either go into forestry in Australia or maybe marine biology, I think.
Exactly.
Right, one of those two.
I did get to see the Great Barrier Reef, and that was exceptional. So
yes, I want to do that someday.
It's interesting, Allie. It feels like you guys have something special going on with forestry in Vermont too, because it seems like a lot of people I know and really respect in forest management somehow are tied to Vermont. So Nancy Patch, comes to mind, Dave Paganelli, Lou Bushy, Ross Morgan, Tony D'Amato. It's like you guys are a hotbed of forestry.
Yeah, we are. I don't know. I mean, I will say too, and I think this is true for a lot of other states, but even just people here have a really deep connection with our forests, right? It's sort of in our state motto, Green Mountain State, that our forests, our identity, leaf peepers coming up here in the fall, but also just people are really connected to, walking in the woods or having their own woodlot. And so I think that really helps too, is that there is such a recognition of the importance of forests in Vermont.
Brad, when we started talking about this, doing these 2 episodes on carbon, we thought this first episode really should focus on some of these fundamental questions of carbon and forests. And so that's where, we got connected with you, Allie. And so maybe that's a really good place for us to start today, is to talk about some of the basics. And one of the basics that we always run into is terminology. So, and being silviculturists, we really love terminology all the time, but we're not as familiar with forest carbon terminology. So maybe that's where we should start today.
Yeah, that's always a good place to start, get all on the same page, because there is I do see this, there's a lot of confusion, or sometimes terms are used differently.
Right.
So that is critical.
So we kind of came up with the list, maybe as a place to start. And one of those is carbon storage. So could you tell us what that is?
Yep. So one of the differences is that we measure carbon based on weight. So it is the weight of those carbon atoms in the tree or the acre of soil, the acre of forest that you're looking at. So when we, as foresters, we are often, looking at trees and we are thinking about the volume of that tree. So we measure diameter, maybe height, and we compute a volume. We can do that same thing to measure the carbon in a forest or a tree, but we have to then take an extra step and convert that volume into weight. And so for each species of tree, that will be different. So we have certain specific gravity is what it's called, but it's basically that conversion of the volume to weight. We also have to consider, is there rot in that tree? Because that affects that volume to weight conversion and the amount of carbon that is in that tree. So it gets more complicated when we're thinking about dead wood, snags, decomposing things in the forest.
So is that weight the same as when we hear carbon dioxide equivalents? Is that the measure?
So there's a couple of reasons that we have to use a standard metric when we're talking about carbon. So one of them is that when a tree is taking in carbon dioxide from the air in photosynthesis, it's actually breaking apart that carbon dioxide molecule and it's using the carbon to build sugars, starches, eventually cellulose and lignin, all those things. So really it's carbon in the tree, but when that tree is burnt or it's decomposed by mushrooms or bacteria, or just when that tree itself uses that sugar as energy, right? Breaks down that sugar molecule for energy, that carbon rejoins oxygen and is emitted as carbon dioxide. So it's much easier because of that to put the carbon in a tree into what we call carbon dioxide equivalents. That's what the amount of carbon dioxide that would be produced when that carbon joins oxygen, if that makes sense. And the other reason we do it is because there's other greenhouse gases that we are concerned with, not just carbon dioxide. We have methane, which is produced by forests naturally, and there's other greenhouse gases. So we convert them all into the same unit. Because really, when we're talking about carbon, why we are interested in carbon in a forest is because it can help us reduce the amount of greenhouse gases, specifically carbon dioxide, in the atmosphere, which is what is causing climate change. And so because trees can take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, called carbon sequestration, so they're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, using it to build their trunks and branches and produce leaves. That's we need a standardized unit to compare human emissions versus what the forests and trees are taking in. So that's just easier for us. We call them carbon dioxide equivalents, just the equivalent amount of carbon dioxide. If it's carbon, if it's methane, we put it all in the same unit.
Okay.
It sounds like, so the other term that you hear a lot is sequestration and sequestration rates. And I think we've been kind of talking a little, that's like you were just kind of, I think, starting on some of that too, right? Like that's where we're kind of locking the stuff up.
Right, exactly. So storage is the amount in that thing. Let's just say a tree. Sequestration is the rate that tree is taking in and storing carbon. So it's really should be sort of expressed over time, right? So maybe over a year or some sort of time frame. And sequestration is, well, if you have sequestration, it means the storage will increase by that amount. So that tree, as it's sequestering carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, will increase in its storage over time.
So could you see then, so we have trees that are storing carbon, or so they're storing, they're also sequestering. Do they ever emit carbon?
Yes. So at the same time that trees and forests, sequester carbon from the atmosphere, they're constantly emitting, and that's a really natural process that happens for really three different reasons. It happens: combustion, so burning. That's probably the easiest one for folks to visualize, right? So that, and then decomposition, which is the breaking apart of wood, basically by fungi or bacteria, insects, all sorts of things like that. That also emits carbon dioxide when it happens. And then it's also just what we call respiration, which is different than, you and I respiring, but it's a similar process in that trees and living things are breaking apart these photosynthates, these sugars that were produced in photosynthesis, and extracting the energy. And that also releases carbon dioxide. So, carbon is not static in our forests. It's really constantly moving. It's very dynamic. And it enters really through the trees and live plants, but then it gets transferred to other parts of the forest. So when leaves fall in the autumn, right, are shed by deciduous trees, that's carbon leaving the live trees, and it goes into the leaf litter carbon pool. So we have these different pools we can think of in the forest: soil, leaf litter, dead wood, live trees, but they're really all connected, and constantly sort of getting connected with the carbon that's coming from the live trees, but will get fluxed to the other pools.
The other term I've heard, carbon sink versus carbon source. So what would define a sink and source in this situation with carbon?
Yeah, it's a common way we'll talk about forests. And it's really, it's that balance of sequestration and emissions. And both of those processes are natural in forests. And it's sort of like a teeter-totter, right? Like one can be bigger than the other. And so if sequestration is bigger than emissions, you have a carbon sink. And that just means that forest over time is taking in more carbon than it's emitting. And that's most of our forests. But there are many reasons, natural reasons or human-caused reasons, why some forests are a source of emissions. That means that they have more emissions than sequestration. And so, example is forest fire, right? So many Western states, their forests are net sink sources of carbon emissions because they burn. But you could have situations where you have a stress event, so a drought, which may be, if it's severe, it could stop trees from photosynthesizing, right? But they still need to break apart their energy sources and have, and grow and sort of survive. So they'll still be respiring. So you can have a condition where, there might not be very much sequestration. You could have a windstorm or disturbance event that actually kills trees. And so sequestration essentially goes to zero, right? If, say, all trees are dead. And then over time, that wood will begin to decompose and emit carbon. And it will take a little while for the new trees, the newly recruited trees, to sort of grow up large enough to balance that out. But there can be a time period where that forest is a source of emissions. And you can see too, I think this is a critical part when we talk about the sink and source, is there's time and space in this, right? So it talks, it really depends over what time are you talking? Are you talking over, a summer? Are you talking over a year, right? Because most of our forests can be sources of emissions during the dormant period when they don't have leaves, right? They still are often using their sugar and starch resources. But over a year, that changes because you have also a growing season where they're actively sequestering. It can also depend on what scale you're talking. Are you talking a single tree? Are you talking an acre? Are you talking a landscape? Because we can have a lot of dynamics in carbon if we look at the small scale, but it sort of evens out a lot more when we look at a larger scale.
Yeah, you can see where this accounting of carbon becomes really complex depending on those scales that you're talking about. I think, Allie, you already touched on it, but as I think about managing a forest, and one of the things that I thought was really useful in your webinar that you have out that we listened to was thinking about those pools of carbon in the forest, because that really helps me think about, how am I managing, am I having the biggest impact? And so can you just touch on that again? Like, what are those major pools that we're dealing with in a forest?
Right. So the most obvious one are the trees, the living trees, but we actually do break that down into the above ground portion and the below ground portion. And partially that's because of how we compute the carbon in those two pools, but I often put that one together and say the live tree pool. Then we also have the dead tree pool. So that could be standing dead snags, logs on the ground in various states of decay. We also have the litter pool, the leaf litter pool on the forest floor. And then we have the soil pool. And that is really a pool of carbon that researchers are learning more and more about every day. We're understanding more and more about how much carbon is in the soil pool and the dynamics of the soil pool, how deep carbon goes into that soil profile. So I will say that that's probably one we're learning the most about as new research comes out.
Is there a general relationship between the pools, like the size of the pools compared to the other, say like, Northeast lake states, Northeast in the United States in general?
It really depends on forest type and climate, actually. So if you think of, tropical rainforests, they actually have a heck of a lot of carbon above ground, right? A lot of diversity of sizes, big trees, but less carbon in the soil because the climate is so warm, decomposition happens very quickly. Compare that to, our sort of neck of the woods where it's colder. We actually can accrue quite a lot of carbon in the soil. And if you go more north of our states too, you can get really deep carbon stores because the climate is cold and you get a lot of buildup of carbon because of dead plants and leaves and organisms that decompose very slowly. So you think there was a tighter link, but it really depends on climate more. When we're in one area, when you look at like the relationship, yes, certainly, in our states of, in our region, New England and the Northeast, certainly if you can look at a forest and there's more above ground biomass, more trees, you're generally going to have more leaf litter, more dead wood, right? So that certainly has a correlation and likely more carbon in the soil as well.
I was just going to say, do we know in our temperate forests then what those relative differences are in carbon, like relatively how much is in the soil pool versus the above ground and below ground live tree pool or so on?
Well, I was sort of interested in looking at your state. So I did look up the carbon percentages for Wisconsin and Minnesota. And I was curious to see how they compare to Vermont and our states out in the Northeast. And all these data come from Grant Domke's team at the Forest Service. And so these are all publicly accessible data. You can look up the data for your state. And it's really interesting to kind of pull apart and compare. And I was really surprised at how similar the proportions are for Wisconsin and Minnesota compared to Vermont and our Northeast states. It was really it sort of makes sense, but it was surprising to see it. And these are not per acre estimates, but the proportions. So, for example, Wisconsin, the amount of carbon in the above ground live biomass that's stored is about 30%. And Minnesota, it's 21%, and Vermont is 30%. So it's pretty similar. For above ground live biomass sequestration in Wisconsin is 78% of the total sequestration, Minnesota 62, Vermont 67. So pretty similar, right? You have a little bit more, below ground biomass is pretty similar. Wisconsin has storage of 6%, sequestration of 15, very similar across Minnesota and Vermont. Litter, Wisconsin has 5% of storage, 3% litter, similar. Where we're really seeing the differences, I would say, is in soil, is across our states. And I think that is because you all have some more organic soils than we do here in the Northeast. And so that's where I'm seeing sort of the differences across our states. But deadwood, pretty similar, 3% in storage in Wisconsin, 4% sequestration. And in the soil, 54% in Wisconsin is stored in the soil, but emissions are about zero, or sequestration is about zero, because it looks like there are some emissions from drained organic soils. And I don't know enough about your states to know exactly what that is, but Minnesota and Wisconsin both had slight source of emissions from soil from this pool called drained organic soil. So I don't know if that's an agricultural conversion thing or what's going on there, but really similar in that across our 3 states, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Vermont, more than half of the total carbon in a forest is in the soil, which is really important. But that soils don't change that much. They don't, you can't, over time, it would be very incremental change in that storage. So in that, they're not, they sort of are very consistent, which does show us that, the take home from that is to protect soils as much as possible, right? So it's hard to build carbon in soils, very easy for it to get lost.
And what would be the ways that we would lose carbon in soils?
Yep. So anything that causes, physical disturbance to soil. So, the biggest one are our road layouts and our equipment use. So being thoughtful with road layout, we have some impacts that are unavoidable. And we have to, have infrastructure for that. But thinking about, can we use the equipment as a least impact? And how would we do that? Is there timing of when we're entering our woods that can reduce impact? It's getting harder and harder with our winters, but frozen soils, frozen grounds are going to be the best option for reducing that impact. But there are also options of, making sure we're using, are there things we can, using corduroy branches, limbs on our trails to sort of reduce impact? Because it's, first of all, about, when we compact soils, we're actually sort of taking out the air spaces in that soil, and we can change decomposition rates. We can release a lot of methane. And remember, I mentioned that methane is a greenhouse gas as well, and a quite potent one. So that's one of the things that we can really do to control impacts on our soils. Anytime we have a place where we have mucky, wet soils, using some sort of, being very mindful of not having impacts. So if you see rutting or anything like that, that's sort of a flag to having an impact on that soil, and that will lead to carbon losses. And the other one is controlling erosion. That's a huge one. So anytime you see soil erosion, that is carbon that's leaving the forest and ends up in our waterways and our lakes and streams and things like that. So stopping erosion is really critical for keeping carbon in the woods.
Before we leave those numbers, I'm curious on that deadwood. Did you see differences between the states there and the percentage of storage in deadwood?
That was the one thing. The storage is really similar across the 3 states. So Wisconsin, 3%, Minnesota, 5%, Vermont, 3%. And I'd have to look into why this is, but for the change in deadwood pools, so the sequestration, so that would be materials fluxing from the live tree pool to the dead pool. So you have branch breakage from disturbance events, or you have trees die, right? That's how that gets into the deadwood pool. In Wisconsin, that's 4%, but in Minnesota and Vermont, it's 16 and 15%. So that suggests that Minnesota and Vermont are really building the deadwood pool, and in Wisconsin, it's not building very quickly. I don't know what that means. Do you already have sufficient deadwood? I don't know what the dynamics are to delve into that a little. I will admit, I've actually never been to Wisconsin. I'd love to see the forest, so I can't say or even speculate what the dynamics are there.
Yeah, and I live here, and I could speculate on anything, but I don't know either. And I was just curious about that because we have a lot of conversations around, the importance of deadwood within forests and managed forests and how to increase that and protect it, those types of things. So that's really interesting. And I think something maybe to explore in the future some more.
I wonder if that relates to markets, like if things would be recruited or they're just simply lost to like with pulp markets being maybe strong in some areas versus others.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing that's, interesting about these numbers is they incorporate so much. They're incorporating what we're seeing in these values now are incorporating, decades of management, land use history on those forested acres. Also species differences, site differences, all sorts of, differences are sort of wrapped up in these numbers. And we particularly see that with sequestration because most of our states, are still recovering from past land use that cleared lots of land of forests. And so we have very rapid active sequestration rates because forests are still sort of in that recovery stage. We know that as forests, as forests age and get older, that rate of sequestration, so that rate that they're taking in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, sort of slows down. So like younger, mid-aged forests are the best at sequestering. Forests will keep storing carbon through their lifetime until they, really, we know that with old growth forests are still very, very, they're active and they're storing a lot of carbon, but that rate with which they're taking it in overall kind of slows down. So it's, when we look at these numbers, we have to incorporate sort of all of that land use history into that interpretation, which, is hard to do.
I think that rate change is really interesting and has implications for how we manage. So you're saying that young forest, that rate of sequestration is greater, and then it slows down as those stands develop. But you also have to look at the storage. You're saying the storage pool grows, obviously, as that stand ages. So,
yep, exactly. So, carbon is just, it's biomass. It's the amount of carbon in those trees. So it's really that, right, where that weight of carbon, the weight of the tree. So if you look at a forest that has lots more trees, more dead wood, more mass, just has more stuff, it's going to have more carbon. And so an older forest just has more dead wood, has deeper soils, more leaf litter, more trees of different sizes and sort of canopy shapes. And so that forest does store more carbon. And that's a very, natural, important role for that older forests provide us. But we also recognize that sequestration rate declines. And so when we think about managing for carbon, if it's for these climate goals, we want to have both storage and sequestration. So this is where forest management can come in. How can we sort of maximize both or consider both as good goals to have? And there are lots of ways we can do that. But it's thinking about those trajectories of forests and using silviculture to sort of guide our management decisions.
I'm curious about, so it's interesting thinking about that relationship of sequestration and storage and thinking about the age classes that you have present on a landscape and how that impacts it. What about species composition? Because I can see like say here in Wisconsin in the upper Great Lakes, aspen plays a huge role. But I'm always curious about, how does aspen play versus maybe what we had historically, white pine or, some of the other species we have. Does that play a big role in carbon storage or sequestration?
It certainly does. And there are big differences by species. So again, it's sort of thinking about, silvics, right? The growth rate of different species and how big they can get. So a white pine, it's just going to be inherently bigger than an aspen, right? So its maximum storage is going to be much, much greater. But the rate of growth of aspen is pretty high. So that would sort of maximize sequestration. White pine can also grow, pretty fast too. So, the other thing we think about is a common area of confusion is the difference between a tree and a forest. Right. So if we think about white pine and aspen is actually a good example of this, right? If we're talking about one tree of each, that white pine is going to take up more space. Right. So if we think about it on an area basis, you could have more aspen, especially thinking about how they reproduce in a clonal system, right? You could have more aspen on an acre than you could have as far as number of stems, number of trees than white pine. And so that does play a part in how we're thinking about forests and forest management. So, it's really, whether we should manage for one species over others for carbon. It's really about that diversity, right? So maximizing storage, maximizing sequestration as best we can, and having the right tree on the right site too, because the best option is keeping that tree alive for as long as possible. And then if we can harvest it for wood products that then will store that carbon for as long as that wood is used, that's the way we maximize carbon in our forests. So making sure that we don't have, early mortality or lots of mortality because of poor management or because of stressors that we can have in our forests. So that's also a key component, is what's the mortality rate? Because once we have mortality, those trees are no longer sequestering carbon, and actually they're now a source of emissions.
Does it matter? And thinking about that too. So, and maybe this is just like, me being super simple, but so I'm picking up a piece of white pine versus I'm picking up a piece of oak. And you talked about specific gravity. So that white pine is huge, but it's really light wood compared to maybe a smaller tree that's really dense wood. How does that come into play?
Yep. So that is a component. So, generally hardwoods are going to have more carbon by weight because they have denser wood, higher specific gravity. That's not always true, but if you think about some of our hardwoods, they're going to have quite a lot of carbon by weight. It's interesting that conifers actually do have quite a lot of carbon by volume because they have a lot of lignin in their wood. But yes, so it sort of depends on, but we're looking at weight when we talk about carbon. And so hardwoods generally, a denser wood is going to have more carbon in it.
So I'm just thinking again about that live tree pool and what are those factors that impact the amount of carbon in that pool. And we talked about, species differences there and interesting differences, as you pointed out, with hardwoods and conifers. And then when we talked about, just kind of forest health, that those trees are healthy, are there other factors that come into play on determining that amount of carbon that we see in that pool?
Yeah, if we're talking about the live tree pool, it's anything that impacts productivity, right? So it's the same things we're thinking about when we're managing for our forest, right? So what are things that increase the health and productivity of our trees? So all those kind of things, right? Site index, nutrient availability, sunlight, spacing, right? Things like that are critically important. And then it's also, what are the things that could potentially remove carbon from the system? So that is timber harvesting, right? Because we are removing, wood is carbon. We're removing carbon from the system. But it's also things like a defoliation event, right? So that seems sort of minor, but that's, insects eating leaves of the trees. So that's where the trees photosynthesize. And we know, that if those kind of events happen, the tree doesn't grow very much, doesn't have a lot of extra resources. And so that affects carbon. A disturbance event that causes branch breakage or mortality, right? So that will change sort of that balance of carbon in the forest. So there's a lot of different things that can change carbon. And it's changing whether we are managing the forest or not, right? It's naturally changing, as I mentioned, as the forest ages, that relative rate of sequestration is changing, right? As you have different events that happen in the forest naturally, those are going to change the dynamics of carbon. So it's really, there are a lot of things that affect carbon.
I think it's really interesting, though, you talking about these factors, and just for me, having a better understanding of these factors, I think it then comes into play into silviculture and management and how we might be able to tweak that. And I know we're going to get into that in, our next episode, but I think that really helps think about where some of those points are where we might be able to, tweak that a little bit in the benefit of more carbon storage and sequestration.
Yeah. And with that in mind, Allie, what are some of the things so if we're foresters and so what are maybe some of the top things we can do as part of our management to tweak a forest for carbon?
Yeah, I think it's a great goal to include, as one of the many goals you'd have in a forest. And I will say that, it's important if we want to manage for forest carbon, that it's not a goal that sort of overpowers the other goals we have in our forest. Because one critical part about managing for forest carbon is to making sure we have a forest that is resilient into the future. And so we could have a lot of carbon in our forest now and have an sort of unhealthy stand of trees that may be really vulnerable to climate change or a pest outbreak, we have a monoculture of a tree, or very small crowns, tree crowns that are unhealthy, prone to wind throw. That's not resilient carbon that's being stored. It's really, vulnerable to being lost, emitted. So I do think it's really critical when we're managing for forest carbon, managing for, what I call resilient carbon, which is thinking about the carbon will be there in the future. So this is also thinking about regeneration and forest health and reducing vulnerabilities. But there are a lot of things we can do to add carbon as a management goal in our forests. And it's really sort of like small tweaks and thinking about things you could do slightly differently. Like I mentioned, the importance of soils, right? Protecting soils and just having that as a really important goal. Reducing residual damage in your woods when you're doing logging. The carbon gains in any one year are probably not big, but over time, if you can reduce mortality from that's introduced by rot, that's really important. Keeping big trees in our forests. We know that big trees contribute disproportionately to storage, just because they're three-dimensional, huge, large trees. They have a lot of carbon storage, but also there's like incredible resilience to having large trees, because they will produce, be a seed source, genetic seed source for your future forest. So you can sort of pair these carbon goals with some resilience goals, and it can be really effective way to think about forest management, in the long term.
And the question that I've heard a couple times, at least in conversations on the tailgate, kind of thinking about it, is that some tools were never really, sometimes tools that we as foresters were not really comfortable with. We look for reasons maybe to use them or not use them based on a particular thing. So fire comes into mind here. So as a forester, should I be worried about fire when I'm thinking about climate change?
That's a great question. Fire is really natural in many forest ecosystems and necessary. We have a number of species that require fire for successful reproduction, to continue their establishment. And so really we've changed our thinking about this, is that we want to have sort of, naturally moderate or light fires, which perpetuate the forest stand, promote forest health, even though there'll be some carbon losses there. In the long term, there will be long-term carbon gains. It will be a good outcome for carbon. So this is, again, getting back to the time frame, thinking about management, right? So we do any management in the woods, there is going to be carbon losses, right? Removal of wood is a carbon loss. Hopefully some of it goes into long-term storage, but even if, some of it goes into, firewood, that is a carbon loss. But if it's done, we do good management in the woods, it allows for recruitment of a new cohort, increases species diversity, all these things we want to achieve in our woods. In the long term, we'll gain that carbon back, right? From increased sequestration of younger trees that have more space, more resources, and sort of a better, healthier, productive system. So it is sort of hard to grapple with that, but we're used to it a little bit when we think about forest. The forest time concept is that we can't look at one day or 1 month or even 1 year, right? A good goal, if you're thinking about managing for forest carbon, is sort of a long-term goal, maybe 10, 20 years. How can I harvest less than growth, right? So you want over time either your carbon storage to be stable or increasing, and you could include harvested wood products in that. If you're harvesting saw timber, things that are going into, structural materials for building, that is storing carbon for the life of that product. And so how can we use management thoughtfully to make sure that our carbon storage is consistent or increasing? And that's one way to do it, is harvest less than growth over time, right? So you need sort of a long time frame to consider that.
It makes me think, just this whole conversation, Brad, about other conversations we've had about the importance of landscape level. As Allie, you mentioned, you want this balance across your landscape of young forests that are sequestering at high rates and old forests that are storing at high rates. And we don't often do a good job of trying to manage on a landscape level to have that balance. And we've had this conversation around other things like trying to maintain oak across a landscape or something like that. But carbon's no different. It seems that we need to be thinking about that.
Yeah, I will say, my answer to what's the best thing to do for carbon is actually to keep forests as forests. That's really the answer, because when we look at the proportion of carbon stored in a forest, it's upwards of, really depends, but for in the Northeast here, it's about 300 or 400 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per acre. The sequestration rate is only about 1 or 2 or 3 metric tons per year. Right. So if you think about a forest, there's a lot stored in it. And so keeping the carbon stored in the soil, keeping that forest growing, that is really the best thing you can do for carbon. And then if we can do little tweaks to increase that, that's really bonus. But when we lose forest land to other uses, we're losing that stored carbon. Most of it, if you're thinking about ripping up stumps, tilling soils, trenching soils. And then we also lose that future sequestration that forest would have provided. So it's sort of a double whammy. So that's really, if we sort of take the 10,000 foot view, really critical importance of that all landowners who own forests or managers of forests are doing.
I really appreciate this conversation, because it feels to me like sometimes, like if you look at forestry, sometimes things change very slowly, sometimes very fast. But in school, we never talked about carbon, at least I'm an older person. So, but I think it's really interesting and fascinating to start to think about new challenges in forestry and how we can apply, because we haven't really changed our tools in the last 100 years. So how are we going to apply these tools to these new challenges? So this has been fascinating.
Yeah, and when you were talking about your age, Brad, I was thinking of carbon jokes, but I'm just not going to go there.
I should have even opened that. I should have just shut that door as soon as you.
Oh man, you're really opening the door there. Yeah, no, I really appreciate this conversation too, Allie, and just kind of walking us through some of those basics, because it really makes me realize, like, I can then start thinking about what I'm doing for silviculture and management, when I can understand, just some of those basic elements. And not only that, just the terminology that is bantied about that you kind of have to have a good awareness of. So yeah, I really do appreciate this conversation too.
Yeah. And I'm not going to be nearly as naked in conversations talking about these topics now either, because I have to admit, like, half of the time I'm like, oh yeah, that's great. No idea what the stuff is behind it. So this is fantastic. Allie, this has been a fascinating conversation. And I sometimes I think I learn a lot from our guests, but I think I really got a lot out of this conversation. So thank you very much. So if our guests want to know more about, say, some of the work you're doing, or maybe dig into a little bit more of this, I know you've done some really interesting work with the Northeast Forest Carbon Program recently that kind of helped outreach with this.
Yes, and thanks for having me. It's been very enjoyable. And if folks want to check out more information, it is focusing on Northeast, but I think all listeners would find information that they find that relates to their forests. A lot of these things I've talked about are pretty universal across all our forests that we have. And so we have a clearinghouse of information called northeastforestcarbon.org. There's resources on there for foresters, for landowners about forest carbon. We have case studies. We have links to tools and ways to estimate forest carbon. And we also have information on forest carbon payment programs and offsets, if you would like more information on that. All the recordings of the 4 webinar series that we've done are listed there as well. And those will have a lot more information that builds upon what we've been talking about here.
Yeah, and Allie, we can get those onto the show notes for people afterwards, so they can get those links, and that would be great, because we know that we're not above, getting information from other people, and know how that goes, Brad.
Yeah, I know how it goes. Yep, exactly.
So thanks again, Allie. It's been great.
Thank you.
All right, Greg, I've got a carbon joke.
Okay, let's hear it.
All right. How does carbon forestry keep you in suspense?
I have no idea.
Don't worry about it. I'll tell you tomorrow. Get it?
I got it. And I knew you'd been working on these carbon jokes, so I was waiting for something big.
I put a little thought into this one, so I hope you appreciate it.
At least you stayed away from the carbon dating jokes, so we don't want to go there.
Well, maybe in the future, Greg. Don't rule that one out yet. Don't rule that one out.
I thought today was a really great conversation with Allie, so I'm really gonna, be able to use that information.
Yep, I was going to say the same thing. I thought it was really good, and I hope everybody got as much out of it as I did because I thought it was really good.
Yep.
Thanks everyone for listening to today's episode of Silvicast. Remember, continuing education credits are available for listening to Silvicast. Check out the Silvicast website for more information. If you have ideas for future episodes or a question for the Dropbox, please let us know. We learn best when we wrestle with questions, so keep them coming.
And take care, everyone. And as always, thanks to our team, Haley Frater, our producer, Noah LeMade, IT Master, theme music by Paul Frater, and of course, UW Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center.